The digestive system is the system responsible for breaking down food into smaller substances that the body can use. There are 5 functions of the digestive system. The first function is to take in food. Once you have taken in food, you must break the food down into smaller substances. We call this process digestion. Once food is broken down into smaller substances, the cells need to absorb it. So once the cells have taken in these nutrients, the cells will put them back together into something that the body can use. This process is called assimilation. And finally, anything not used by the body is eliminated as waste. There are 2 types of digestion. The first type is physical digestion. And the best way to explain physical digestion is to give you examples. So examples of physical digestion are ripping, chewing, churning, grinding, or mixing. The second type of digestion is chemical digestion. In chemical digestion, digestive secretions, which we'll talk about in a later lecture, break down food. So in the overall process of digestion, we want to take food, preferably something we like, and we want to break it down into smaller pieces or molecules, which you now know is called digestion. And those smaller molecules are called macromolecules. And the macromolecules we discussed in biology were proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. And we want to continue to further break down these macromolecules into their monomers. So like, for example, proteins are amino acids, lipids would be fatty acids in a glycerol molecule, carbohydrates would be glucose, and then nucleic acids would be the nucleotides. So once we've broken the food into smaller substances, we want the cells to take them in, and we call this absorption. And once these cells have absorbed these nutrients, then these cells can reassemble them into something that the body can use. So we can make new parts, or we can use them for energy. There are 2 divisions of the digestive system. The first division is called the alimentary canal, which also can be called the digestive tract or the gastrointestinal tract. Now, the alimentary canal is the passageway for food. Some organs of the alimentary canal have dual function. Not only will they serve as a passageway, but some organs can secrete digestive juices. The alimentary canal extends from the mouth all the way to the anus. The second division of the digestive system are the accessory organs. Accessory organs are organs that secrete digestive juices into the alimentary canal to aid in digestion. The accessory organs of the digestive system are the salivary glands, the liver and gallbladder, and the pancreas. Before we talk about the different organs of the alimentary canal and the accessory organs, we need to talk about the membranes found within the abdominal cavity. The membranes found in the abdominal cavity are called the peritoneum, and the peritoneum is a serous membrane. And this serous membrane has 4 parts. The first part is the membrane, or is the part of the membrane, that actually touches the abdominal organs themselves. We call this the visceral peritoneum. Then you have a part of the serous membrane that attaches to the inner wall of the abdominal cavity, called the parietal peritoneum. And in between the 2 membranes is a peritoneal cavity, and this space is filled with peritoneal fluid, which will help reduce friction and act as a shock absorber. Another membrane in the digestive system that connects the different parts of the small intestines to one another is called the mesentery. And the mesentery is connective tissue that connects the parts of the small intestines to one another. You can see that embedded in this mesentery are blood vessels. And these blood vessels will deliver nutrients and oxygen to the different parts of the small intestine. The last of the membranes of the digestive system are called the omentums, and there are two omentums. The first omentum is called the lesser omentum. The other omentum is called the greater omentum. The lesser omentum connects the lesser curvature of the stomach to the inferior side of the liver. So here's the lesser omentum, and you can see that the lesser omentum attaches the lesser curvature of the stomach to the inferior side of the liver. The greater omentum is a membrane that looks more like a fat pad that attaches the greater curvature of the stomach to the intestines. So here's the greater omentum, and you can see that the greater omentum attaches the greater curvature of the stomach to the intestines. And this greater omentum will cover all of the intestines. The first part of the alimentary canal is the oral cavity, which is where physical and chemical digestion first take place. Recall that physical digestion is the chewing, the ripping, the tearing, the churning of food into smaller parts. And physical digestion in the oral cavity is accomplished by a couple of structures. The first structure is the teeth, which are responsible for the chewing. Next, you have the tongue, which is responsible for the churning of the food, mixing it up. Then you have lips, cheeks, the hard palate, and soft palate, which holds the food in the mouth. At the end of the soft palate, you have a structure called the uvula, which closes off the nasal cavity during swallowing. Chemical digestion in the oral cavity is accomplished by the salivary glands, which we'll talk about in a future lecture. And salivary glands secrete a substance called saliva. So looking at the structures of the oral cavity from a lateral view, you have the teeth, the tongue, the lips, the hard palate, the soft palate, and again at the end of the soft palate you have this structure called the uvula, which during swallowing swings back and closes off the opening to the nasal cavity. The process of chewing food is called mastication, and the product of mastication, chewed food plus saliva, is what we call bolus. When food is done being chewed, that bolus is pushed to the back towards the pharynx. Now recall, the pharynx is the common passageway for food and air. And the pharynx has three parts: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The process of swallowing is called deglutition. So in step A, food is being chewed. So mastication is taking place. In step B, you can see that the tongue pushes up against the hard palate, which forces food towards the pharynx. In step C, the tongue pushes up against the soft palate, causing food to move into the oropharynx. Now notice, as food is being pushed to the oropharynx, the uvula, which is at the end of the soft palate, is forced up, closing off the nasal cavity. In step D, food moves to the laryngopharynx. And in step E, a ring of smooth muscle around the esophagus, called the upper esophageal sphincter, relaxes, allowing food to enter the esophagus, which is letter F. A sphincter is a ring of smooth muscle found at the opening or the end of a passageway. And the function of a sphincter is to prevent food from moving backwards. So as food enters a passageway, the sphincter relaxes, and as soon as that food passes the sphincter contracts, not allowing food to move backwards. From the pharynx, bolus enters the esophagus, and the esophagus is the passageway between the pharynx and the stomach. In order to propel food down the esophagus, a process called peristalsis takes place. So peristalsis is the rhythmic contraction of smooth muscles which causes food to move down the esophagus. So smooth muscle that encircles the esophagus contracts, pushing food downward. So here we have another set of smooth muscles contracting, propelling food downward until it finally reaches the stomach. The stomach is a J-shaped pouch where physical and chemical digestion will continue. There are different parts of the stomach. The first part is this region here called the cardiac region. Then you have the fundic region, the body, the pyloric region, and at the end of the pyloric region, you have something called the pyloric sphincter. Within the stomach, you see these tiny little folds called rugae, and rugae contain gastric glands. As food enters the stomach from the esophagus, a ring of smooth muscle around the esophagus, called the lower esophageal sphincter, also called the cardiac sphincter, closes, preventing food from going backwards. Once food is in the stomach, gastric juices mix with food, further chemically digesting the food. Gastric juice plus food, or bolus, is now called chyme, which is a pasty fluid substance. As chyme passes through the stomach and into the small intestine, it passes by the pyloric sphincter. Once that chyme is in the small intestine, the pyloric sphincter closes, preventing food from moving back into the stomach. Taking a closer look at the rugae, or the folds inside the stomach, we see that rugae are composed of structures called gastric glands. And these gastric glands are composed of a variety of different cells, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And in between these gastric glands is a gastric pit, where gastric juice is secreted into. So let's talk more a little bit about gastric juice. Gastric juice is composed of a variety of different substances. One is mucus, the other one is hydrochloric acid, and another is called pepsinogen, which, when combined with hydrochloric acid, produces a substance called pepsin. Taking a closer look at the cells that make up the gastric glands, the first type of cell is a mucus cell, and a mucus cell produces mucus. And then you have a parietal cell, and a parietal cell produces hydrochloric acid. And then you have the chief cells, which produces pepsinogen. The small intestine is the major organ where nutrient absorption takes place. And there are three parts to the small intestine. The first part, which is the part closest to the stomach, is called the duodenum. The part of the small intestine that's usually found in the middle is called the jejunum. And the last part, which is the part of the small intestine that's closest to the large intestine, is called the ileum. So as chyme passes through the small intestine, remember that chyme is a pasty material, and that fluid material, or that pasty material, is easily absorbed by the cells of the small intestine. Taking a closer look at the inner wall of the small intestine, you can see that the small intestine is kind of bumpy or has a lot of ridges. Well, those ridges are what we call circular folds. And those circular folds contain these tiny little bumps called villi, or villus for singular. And each individual villus, right, so here's a villus here, right, and each individual villus has a bunch of cells on its surface. And on the surface of those cells are tinier structures called microvilli, or microvillus singular. The function of the microvilli is to increase surface area for maximum absorption of nutrients. Once all the nutrients the body needs is absorbed in the small intestine, that chyme enters the large intestine. The large intestine is the organ responsible for reabsorbing water and electrolytes. So structures that are found on the large intestine or are part of the large intestine are the following. You have the appendix, which is part of the lymphatic system and contains lymphocytes. You have the cecum, which is what we call this blind pouch. Then you have a valve found between the large intestine and the ileum of the small intestine, which we call the Ileocecal Valve. And that ileocecal valve is like a sphincter and prevents food from going back into the small intestine. And then finally you have the major structures of the large intestine, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, the descending colon, the sigmoid colon, and the rectum. As chyme passes through the large intestine and water is reabsorbed, what's left is a solid material stripped of water called feces. Feces is stored in the rectum until defecation. Defecation is the process of eliminating solid waste. So as waste is eliminated, it passes through the anal canal and exits the opening called the anus. Surrounding the anal canal is both smooth and skeletal muscle called the anal sphincter. The anal sphincter is under voluntary and involuntary control. In other words, you can control it. And the function of the anal sphincter is to prevent feces from moving back up into the rectum.